It is the second hour of ITG here on a Monday. Mike Morgan, Jamie Bradford, Mad Dog Phil Mullinax, JC out today. He'll be back with us tomorrow. Hour number 2, presented by Joe Lurie of Lurie Life and Health for all of your FMO needs, for needs with Medicare, health, life insurance. The service is absolutely positively free. They have been in the business for a long time, helping South Carolinians. One simple phone number, 803-256-2067. So we've saved you money on appliances. This service is actually free, 803-256-2067. That is Joe Lurie and Lurie Life and Health. Jamie?
Yeah, it is hour 2. The national anthem, of course, always brought to you by our friends at Edward Jones and Eric Ponder. Eric graduated at Carolina, and he served the nation overseas in the Middle East and down on the southwest border, 2 places you probably don't really want to have to be. But he went there, and now he's serving your financial futures. EdwardJones.com. Eric Ponder, 864-862-2161. Do we need to introduce Ellis Johnson? Doesn't everybody know who Ellis Johnson is, Coach Johnson?
Everybody knows who he is, but Ellis, I will say this, and I go back to, I mean, we used to have you on the show back when you were the coordinator, but I remember being on the air in Columbia when Steve hired Brian Van Gorder.
Yeah.
We had the first interview with Coach Van Gorder. It's like, okay. Next thing I know, it was like 48 hours later, whatever it was, he's gone. He's gone to the Falcons. And then I remember you getting the job. And I just remember a number of people that I trust saying, this is the guy we should have hired all along. So with that introduction, and I already said, you can't write a book on the Gamecock glory years, that 4-year span, without a chapter on you. Number one, great to have you on, and I hope you'll do this again. And I've got so many questions. I hope you've got a few minutes for us. But take me through what happened when you didn't get it the first time around, and how you got it the second time around. Your relationship with Steve and how that whole thing was finalized. Because if memory serves, you wanted a 3-year deal, correct? Like that was if you weren't going to get at least a 3-year deal, that was a non-starter for the retirement and everything else. Just take us through that.
That part was true, but it wasn't the hang up at all. Steve was very good about that. What happened, and it really is a funny story. If you think y'all were surprised when Brian came in and went back out, that's only about a tenth of the whole merry-go-round. If you will remember, Brian was at the Atlanta Falcons, and he was coaching for Bobby Petrino. And Bobby Petrino left before the season was over. And what job did he take? He took Arkansas.
That's right.
Brian ended up, didn't have a job there at the Falcons, so he came to South Carolina. Not long after that, what was the head coach came from the Jaguars? Was it Smith? I'm drawing a blank, but
from the Jags.
The Falcons hired one of the old Petrino group from the Jags to be the head coach. And I can't get his name out right now, but he immediately hired Brian to come back.
Okay. So, yeah, gotcha.
So, but what was happening at Carolina, guys, and I don't want to get into too much of the weeds, but President Sorensen was there then, and we had an issue at Alabama before he left there. And I had a contract dispute with them, and an attorney took it over. I kind of took it out of my hands and sued him, and it didn't work, of course. But it was some ill feelings. And Sorensen asked Steve not to hire me, and Coach Holtz had tried to hire me earlier, a year or two earlier, and had the same thing happen. So when that happened with Brian, Steve went back and he said, Dr. Sorensen, it was who I wanted to start with, and now I've reached a point now I've got to hire him. And I think he was just able to, to get him to agree to it. And that's how it all happened. But the merry-go-round with the coaching part, I thought was hilarious, because guess who I was working for when it finally happened? Well, I left Mississippi State. I was working for Bobby Petrino.
Right.
And when Brian left and went back to the Falcons, and Steve had Shane call me, because we had worked together at Mississippi State. And Shane wanted to know if I was interested in the job. I said, Shane, do you know everything that's been going on with this? He said, Coach, I don't know anything. He said, he just asked me to call you, and I'm calling you. And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you the whole thing, but I said, it got kind of sticky. He's already offered me the job once, and it didn't work because of the president. I said, I can't go through that again. And he said, Coach, I'm just told to call you, and I'm calling you. So anyhow, it got connected, and that's how I ended up there.
Did you and Steve? I mean, obviously you'd crossed paths before, but I mean, it seemed like you guys were in sync from day one. Did you hit it off right away?
Well, I think that was because we were both very experienced coaches. I had never had the opportunity to work with him. I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm not sure I ever spoke to him in person during all
Really?
those years. I don't remember it. And I was working under Bill Oliver at Alabama, and we were very close because I considered him my mentor. And Bill was constantly, they encountered each other in the old USFL, and they were kind of respectful rivals, if you will. And there were a couple of times we may have hired Bill, but it just wasn't the right situation. And then a couple other times, Bill was trying to get Steve to hire him. He wanted to go to the Redskins, in fact, and Steve didn't take him and didn't hire him. But I was always kind of included on the deal, and it moved along. And we've had obviously I've coached against him several times, and we had some success. In the championship game one year, and played them well even when we were at Mississippi State. Most of the time, though, I was on the short end of that deal. And I hope there was a mutual respect. I know I always wanted to work for him, and I always wanted to come back to the state of South Carolina, and was excited, to get the opportunity to do that.
For those that
But
don't,
I think the way it fit. The other thing you have to remember, the defensive staff was Shane, Ron Cooper, and Brad Lawing, and I had worked with all three of those guys prior in my coaching career, and it just fell right in place. And Ron took off to LSU after the first year, but Lorenzo Ward and I had worked together. He was my graduate assistant, and Steve agreed to hire him, and he came in, and we didn't miss a beat. So it was a good situation, just kind of fell in place.
it certainly did. And you mentioned Bill Oliver, or as a lot of fans now would call him back in Alabama, a brother Bill Oliver. There's still a little bitterness about that whole thing going from one team to the other, as you well know. But that was one guy that actually had success against Spurrier in the glory years when he was at Florida, beat him in 93 and 94. And his defenses had a load of interceptions and picks. So he always was fond of Bill, I know. And obviously he was very fond of the job you did. But I do remember I had an Auburn contact during that time that was like, well, that's great. I mean, Ellis is a terrific hire, but I'm telling you right now, Steve's going to take the Auburn job. And that was a serious rumor back in the day. Do you remember just kind of, were you on pins and needles at all? Because there was a lot of people that were still trying to poach Steve from South Carolina.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they were. Now, at the time I was hired, I wasn't aware of him looking at other places, and it never came up in our conversations. Now, I do know after that first year, uh, he and Junior and I went up to see Stephon Gilmore on a home visit, and I knew that some rumblings were going on. Auburn was trying to hire a coach. I think there was a couple of boosters over there that were more after Steve than Steve was after that job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And anyhow, we got back in the car, we left Stephon's house, got in the car, we were driving out of the driveway, and Feinbaum had called Steve. So I can't remember if he took the call, returned the call while we were riding along, or if he just got the message, voicemail. But Junior's over there wanting to go to Auburn. And I'm sitting in the back seat saying, no, God, don't leave. And so I just didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, uh, but there were people over there that were really after him. And I think I know the main one. I'm not going to get into all that. But they're kind of like Auburn's different. They've kind of got 8 power brokers over there, maybe. And I'm just throwing that number up. And they don't ever seem to be on the same page. And they all can turn things and make things move over there, but sometimes not going the same direction. So I don't know if this guy finally gave up or Steve didn't want it or what happened. But at the same time, that was just after my first year there. And you mentioned the 3-year. One of the main things I wanted was a 3-year guaranteed contract. In case he did leave, I wanted to be able to stay because I wanted to work 3 years in the state of South Carolina. More, but at least 3. But if you remember, that's when Dabo took over at Clemson. And we had some back channel communications there because I was scared to death. And Steve took off out of state. I wanted to work for him really bad, but I didn't want to leave the state. And I had no idea. They had to pay me that 3-year contract, but they could have put me in charge of the lining off the field if they wanted to. So we had some communication through a third party in case Steve left.
I'll just add one other story on that time frame, because it's really easy to forget now that nobody thought Steve was going to last over 10 years at South Carolina. Most people didn't give it more than 5. I remember somebody, again, I'm on the middle of my show, and somebody says, you got to turn on Feinbaum. And honestly, I didn't watch a whole lot of Feinbaum back then, but there's Bill Oliver, who we were just talking about, and he's telling Paul, oh, I'm pretty sure it's going to happen. Alabama's going to go ahead and get Steve to leave South Carolina. This is before they got turned down by Rodriguez. They wound up with Saban, but there were heavy rumors. And you had Alabama fans calling the show for 4 hours saying, oh, yeah, well, Steve's our guy. We hated him when he was at Florida, but we'll gladly steal him from South Carolina. Well, you never got him. So, I mean, there are a lot of teams that were trying to get that man away from Columbia. And to his credit, and obviously to the benefit of the program, he never left. But it was always rumors out there. And you were in the middle of all of that.
Yeah, well, when he first came, I think he was committed kind of in his own mind I think he talked about maybe a 4 or 5 year window. And I really feel like, and I don't like to talk about other people's situations I don't know.
Oh, no. Our first drop.
It should be back soon. It looks like a phone call.
Oh, there you are. All right.
We're back. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
We're good.
I got you.
Off the phone call.
Yeah.
I told you I was working with limited equipment here, Mike. So
That's all right.
That was my nephew trying to call me. He'll probably try again.
That's okay. You're sounding and looking great, Coach. Keep it going.
I think early on, Steve was definitely committed because he wanted to accomplish some things there that nobody had ever done before.
Mm-hmm.
He's always motivated by goals, and of course everybody is. And I think that at the time where he felt like he'd kind of done what he could do, he wanted to turn that thing over to his son or somebody on the staff, and it wasn't set up good. And I think that's why he kept passing on some of those jobs as it moved on. And then I think the other thing is we got out on the road and we got some great players in there, and he was having fun once we started. We were playing with the top of the league, and we didn't have to, trick anybody there for a few years. We were playing at the top of the league, and I think he enjoyed that.
I'll just throw this in, and I'll ask one more quick one before I have Jamie jump in here. Ellis Johnson, again, our guest. 3 times you had a top 15 national defense. One of them finished 3rd in the country. If that's ever done again at Carolina, I mean, superb, because that's nearly impossible to do at almost any school. You did it. And I remember, and I talked about this before you jumped on, Coach, that glut of talent, I mean, in Rock Hill alone was unreal with Gilmore and Clowney and other. And you guys, and I know you were big on the recruiting trail, you were able to lock them all down to set up those glory years on defense. So if you can't just expand on the impact of those guys, how important it was to obviously dominate in-state recruiting, but what a luxury it was to have that glut of elite, all-American NFL-type talent in the state during that 2, 3, 4 year window.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike. And we did. We got out and we got them. And we had some people we had to beat that normally South Carolina does not beat on the recruiting trail. But it is noticeable. I don't know that there's been that many really good football players come through at the same time, and not just in Rock Hill, but there were about 8 of them in Rock Hill. But you had Marcus and you had so many others that were not in the Rock Hill area, but they came in that 2 or 3 year period. Alshon. Now, when I walked in the door, Brad Lawing had already brought Melvin Ingram in there. Mm-hmm. And we all went down and Shane, was recruiting Alshon. And then we had some other guys that were already there, but just hadn't really broken out yet. Brad recruited Culliver out of Raleigh. So it was a unique time because those guys that were up there in Rock Hill at that little space of time, and I had been in that conference as a high school coach and knew so many of those guys so well, and it really helped me, I think, to go up there and be able to recruit them. we've signed the number one player in the country, and sometimes these recruiting services still come out and rank Clowney as the biggest, most perfect, or whatever their little recruiting things are in the country ever. And we got him at South Carolina, the school that had never won but one title. And I think it took a lot of guts for that kid to do that. But I'll tell you and I'll say we because it wasn't just me. One of the reasons we got those kids, mainly Stephon, once we got him, we had Rock Hill. And really, the way I got Stephon was Coach McLeod, who's an assistant principal up there and coached younger teams and was an assistant on the varsity. And he just had tremendous influence over those kids. And if you remember, his son Nick came through too while we were there with Muschamp. And they passed on him, and I think it was a mistake. And Nick's still playing with the Giants. But Coach Nakia McLeod was my go-to guy in the school. And I don't know if I'd have gotten those guys without him.
Off of that, Coach, good to see you, and thank you so much for spending time with us. We cannot thank you enough. And we want to talk to you about Shane and all that stuff too. But I'm glad that Mike brought up the Rock Hill connection and how impactful that was to this Carolina football program for so many years. There's a young man now who's a true freshman on this team named Dylan Stewart. Shane and his staff got him out of the D.C. area last year. He's probably the best defensive end prospect to come through here since Jadeveon. Prospect. I don't know about player yet. He hadn't stepped foot on the field yet, Coach. But he does often get compared to Jadeveon and just how he portrays himself when he's on the field. You can see it. You can see the ability. And then we'll see what it's like when the lights come on here in a few weeks and so on and so forth after that. But Jadeveon Clowney did not step on campus and start for your defense. It took him some time to work into that. Can you go back as much as you can into his arrival and what he needed to work on, what y'all felt like you needed to do to develop him, to get him ready to play and make an impact his freshman year, and what the plan is for a kid of that much talent who everybody's expecting to see, but there were talented guys around him like Devin and Melvin and all those other guys. What was that experience like? And maybe it'll give Carolina fans a little bit of insight into what this go around might be like with Dylan Stewart.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know Carolina's roster as well as I maybe did 4 or 5 years ago, and I certainly don't keep up with recruiting in any depth. I've seen how highly he was rated. I don't know what he's got to compete with to take that job. When Jadeveon came in, I mean, we didn't know it. We thought he could take the job. We weren't going to give it to him. But you've got Devin Taylor, you've got Cliff Matthews, you've got Melvin. And those guys could play now. Melvin was a better athlete than Clowney overall. Now, he wasn't as dominant in some ways, but Melvin was just the most productive guy, just a unique guy. And as you saw, he made All-Pro in the NFL probably more times than Clowney did or has so far. And Cliff Matthews, he's not nearly as talented as those guys, but I don't care who we would have signed that year. They weren't going to take Cliff Matthews' job. I'd have bet that. And Devin Taylor, he held his own for a while there too until Jadeveon broke in. The luxury of those guys is when it was an obvious pass situation, we could move Melvin around and we'd have two ends out there like Clowney and either Devin or Cliff, and then have Melvin. We could place him over anybody we wanted to. So it was just a devastating group. If you got in pass situation against us, we were better than you were, whether we were coming in the game or not. Overall, we were a better football team than you were, and it was a big deal. But he had to earn his way. Some of it was a little bit mental, just learning all the assignments and all that kind of thing. But a lot of it was just technique. If y'all can probably remember him, he played like a wild horse, and a lot of people claim he didn't play hard every play, and that was BS. He played so hard sometimes he just burned himself out. And Brad had to be really alert to subbing him and getting him in and out of the game and making sure he was fresh.
Coach, the 2010 game versus Alabama, I've worked with a couple of guys that are on that Alabama team, Greg McElroy and Barrett Jones, and they still have nightmares about that game. Alabama was a runaway freight train, defending national champions, and a lot of people had already given them the title in 2010, and then they roll up in Williams-Brice. and you guys humbled them immensely. How much does that game stick out in your mind as kind of a difference maker in where the program was versus where it was going?
Well, it was huge. And I can remember, to speak directly to your point about being the turning point, we already were a good team. I mean, we had some great players. But if you remember, Clowney wasn't there yet, but he was at that game. And I'd been trying to tell him with some guys like him, we could play and beat those guys. And he didn't need to go somewhere else to do that. And he had not committed. He wasn't one of these early commit guys. And we happened to walk into the locker room at the same time. You know, I can't remember who was escorting him, whatever. And I said, I told you we can beat these guys. And if you come, we will win championships and so forth. And I would bet, he never really said this, but I would bet that was one of the three major factors in his decision, because he always kind of wanted to stay home. And like I said, Stephon could tell them all what to do, and they'd almost do it. But we knew it's still going to be a big fight. And I think that had a lot to do with his decision of saying, I can do this and I'm going to win a championship. It never did, but I think they liked it. I think if you ask any of those guys, they'll be glad. They'll say, I was glad I went to Carolina. But I think the game was that kind of a game for us. And then we continued to recruit great players. The thing about it is we just didn't have that glut that Mike referred to earlier. We still, and even I left after the next year, and that was Marty recruited to sign Clowney and then coached him 1 year and left. That's good coaching, isn't it? But they continued to get I think the better players in South Carolina, but there weren't that many that were that level at that time.
Mm-hmm. I remember I was filling in hosting the Spurrier call-in show one week, and I don't even know how his name came up, but you mentioned him earlier, and that's Brad Lawing. And he said, Mike, Brad Lawing's the best defensive line coach I've ever worked with. Like, wow, that's a pretty strong statement coming from a Hall of Fame coach that's worked with a lot of talented people. What was your take on the impact that Brad Lawing had?
That was tremendous. One of the most unique things about Brad, and so I tell you, I worked with all those guys before. Brad and I worked together at Appalachian State. Mac Brown hired us. Brad was a GA, and I was just coming in as a defensive coordinator for him. And then Mac turned around a month later and went to Oklahoma to run the offense for Barry Switzer, and I coached for Sparky. So I had Brad as a young coach, and I put Brad and Donnie Kirkpatrick. They all came to Carolina with Sparky, if you remember. Put them in charge of the defensive front. Brad had tackles, and back then we called it a wide tackle 6, and Donnie had the ends. And they coached him as good as any 15-year veteran you could want. But he was tremendous about being flexible. A lot of defensive line coaches are real stuck in their way. They can coach the heck out of them technique-wise and they're tough on them, and they get them to play hard, and they got them motivated. But they don't want to tweak the game plan ever. They don't want to change anything for their guys. They want their guys, you know, they don't want to be the guys that have to make changes. Let this guy do it. Let the linebackers in the secondary do it. And he was not like that. And I would come up with some concept I wanted to look at against a certain team or something, and he'd say, let's do it. And we'd go Monday or Tuesday with it or whatever, and then we'd decide what to do. And if he said he didn't want to use it, I always trusted him because he was always willing to try it. And I miss him a lot and missed him a lot after I left there. And I mean, I tell you, it was one of the best coaching relationships I ever had.
You know, can I ask something real quick here, Mike?
Sure.
I get a chance to talk to Coach Mangus a lot. I love Coach Mangus. I feel like he's a lot like you and a lot like Brad, Coach Lawing, excuse me, and Coach Spurrier. That felt like a very honest group of coaches. And we live in a world now where it's all about recruiting and signing players, and now you got NIL and the portal and all. And there's a lot of guys out there that say things that I don't know that they're always entirely true, Coach. They'll tell you what you want to hear, maybe to get you in the program, and then from there, who knows what happens. But I felt like just over the years and speaking with Shane and speaking with Coach Mangus and so many of my buddies that played in that program, like Pat DeMarco and Garcia and on and on and on, there was an honesty about that staff under Coach Spurrier. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, you already answered it with that very last tail on the end of it. I think that was a reflection of Steve. He didn't like to hire a bunch of rah-rah guys, and he really didn't like being around them. And I think whether it was recruiting hype or whether it was, jumping around like a wild dog on the practice field or anything else. And I'm not saying he didn't like emotional and stuff like that, but he just didn't really care for all of it. And he didn't hire people that were like that. And if you had one on staff, they usually were gone pretty soon. And I just think that's what it was. We were normal guys. We like to have fun. We probably did a lot of stuff we're not going to talk about on here. But it wasn't that way when it came down to the program and recruiting and coaching and how you related to the players and all that. And I think the players feel the same way what you just expressed. I think our players kind of felt that way. And as Stephen told me the other day about the first time he and I had an encounter, and I don't even remember it. I think he's lying, frankly. But he said, I jumped his butt out there running sprints at the end of practice and told him, you kind of whatever. And I don't know what he said I said, but I don't think I said it. But I jumped him about clowning around. I said, you ain't played in the SEC football game yet, man. And he said he always remembered that and appreciated it. So that may be a good example, but I think our players were the same way. We didn't have a lot of rah-rah guys out there and celebrators and this crap. They just got the job done. And I mean, we had some characters now, but I don't think they expressed it on the field.
Coach, this might be the most difficult question I ask you, and I'll preface it by saying in a random week in 2012, my analyst and I had just done a game in Tuscaloosa, so we just saw, the cream of the crop. I think they were playing like Western Kentucky, not a very good team at that time. And then on the schedule the following week was a game at Southern Miss. So I was there, and I talked to you and Clyde Wren, and
Yep.
I don't know what it was, like week 7, week 8, and you could already tell, like, man, this was just a bad situation. Like, I truly felt for you. I know you were not handed the keys to a great automobile. I know, having worked with Brett Favre, of all people, the most prominent alum of Southern Miss, and him telling me, Mike, Southern Miss just doesn't have any money, so they're never going to be ready for the big time. And I just thought to myself, gosh, I know everybody wants to be a head coach, but you had built such a great thing defensively at South Carolina. Again, 3 top 15 defenses. You certainly felt like you could keep going with that. Do you ever look back at that decision, knowing what you know now and knowing just how dire Southern Miss situation was? You ever think to yourself, man, if I just stayed in Columbia, I could have been a part of some really memorable seasons some more? Any regret at all in that move?
I don't think regret's the right word.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't regretted any move I've made in 45 to 50 years of coaching, but I did have 2 that if I had the chance to do it over, I would have done it differently, and that's one of them. What happened with me on Southern Miss, as you said before, I was there in the late 80s when we had Brett Favre. We were also independent. We weren't in a conference.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, if y'all remember, it was a Prop 48 rule. And if you didn't make certain grades and so forth, you couldn't scholarship a player. And at the time, the SEC finally decided as a conference that everybody could either take 1 or 2. I can't remember. And we were able to take as many as we could. And we were bringing in about 7 or 8 SEC guys. And I was there 3 years. We were bringing in SEC guys that were missing that. I think it was that SAT or ACT
700.
cutoff.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, when we lined up, Coach Dye told me one time, he said, that team y'all had the last year y'all came up here might have been more physical than we were. And I said, Coach, I said, I know you're a great coach. I said, that's a stupid statement because nobody more physical than your Auburn teams. But he meant it. And we were pretty dang good now. It wasn't fluky when we play against those guys. We'd play them head up. Well, those days are gone because everybody's got the exact same academic admissions. As you said, they don't have any money. I kind of got caught up in our the time I had there before, to me, I used to always use the expression that Southern Miss does more with less than any other program in America. And that was true for a long time, but changing the rules and all that kind of leveled the playing field. The second thing, a lot of people thought Larry Fedora, who left, Larry was not upfront with me about it. Larry was great. We were pretty good friends professionally. He went through the whole depth chart. He told me, he said, you got to rebuild. I'm just telling you, only got about three of your men coming back on defense and the difference makers. You got a pretty good offensive line coming back and some running backs. He said the quarterback's been starting for 4 years. Nobody else has gotten to play. They've got some kids we think we signed that are okay, and then the receiver core is gone. Everybody that produced in the receiver core. So, he was very honest about that. The problem was I didn't do my homework on it. There was administration problems going on that were absolutely just a rotten cancer. And to be honest, that not winning a game, nobody wants to go through that. You get tired of coming in that locker room after a game and trying to pick those guys up off the floor. But that wasn't the worst part of that tenure. I was there, believe it or not. It was those first 5 or 6, 4 or 5 months. Might have been when you came by, Mike, because I think you were doing a basketball game. And it was already just as rotten as it could be. And I had big concerns at that time whether we were going to be able to turn the thing. And we had about 14 JUCOs coming in for an official visit when I got told I'm not coming back. And the guy had never been an AD before, and he was a retired general that played quarterback at Southern Miss. He just wanted to try to run the program himself. He told me I had to fire Ricky Bussell, Tommy West, and Steve Buckley, three of the most accomplished coaches on my staff. And he probably had all those JUCO kids recruiting. And I said, you're going to destroy the whole program. And I said, I'm not firing them. And so they had to honor my contract, but that's what it was over. I told them I wasn't firing those coaches, and I didn't. But that's what happened. But you're exactly right. I would do that one differently because I knew I made a very bad mistake. And there was one other one I won't get into, but I don't like to ever use the word regret because I kind of look at it. If I hadn't gone to Southern Miss, wouldn't have got to Auburn and played in the national championship game the next year, which we had just about, in our pocket. Really hard fought game. We had 2 kicking game situations that probably lost the game for us.
You mentioned your relationship with Shane, who, by the way, told me I've got to ask you about the going back to your days at Starkville, the Cracker Barrel Cartel. I'll let you expand on that. I have no idea where he's going with that, but I can only imagine having been to Starkville several times. But what did you like during your time at both spots, working with Shane and just seeing the obvious grooming, if you will, for him to be one day be a head coach? What was it about Shane that you always thought highly of?
Well, I'll start this off. Somebody asked me a question the other day. Said, you coached around Shane and Dabo when they were real young coaches. Did you look at them then and say, man, these guys are going to be head coaches one day? And I thought, no. I said, I don't look at any coaches like that and think what they might be in 10 to 15 years. But I understand what the reason they're asking the question, and it's sort of what you're asking. I played for Shane and Dad at Citadel. He was our secondary coach. And I didn't play for him positionally, but he was our secondary coach all 3 years I played for Coach Ross. But so I kind of feel like I knew the family and I knew Shane, who he was and everything. And Woody McCorvey got Sly to hire him at Southern Miss, at Mississippi State, because it was his first full-time job. And he had been a grad assistant at Tennessee and Georgia Tech. And Woody was there with him at Tennessee when he came to coach with Sly. And he convinced Sly to give him a shot. And he was always an excellent coach. The first year we were together, I had to coach the safeties, which I'd never coached, and coordinate the defense. And I had Shane in the corners. And he did a heck of a job. I don't think he'd ever coached corners before. I had never coached safeties before. And to me, we had a good, solid defense, and we got better. By the time we left, we were in the top half of the conference and might have been top 2 or 3 in the conference in some of the categories. but he did a great job. And then, of course, came South Carolina. And by that time, we tweaked and molded our defense. We were almost running at South Carolina the same defense that Coach Beamer ran at Virginia Tech. And Shane didn't play on that side of the ball, but I'm sure he knew the basic concepts. But when we came in, and I changed a little bit from the 3-4 to the 4-2, and him being there was, it's just an easy transition. Like I said, Brad had been with me before with that front four, and everything just kind of flipped in place. But you just never know. I mean, I know both, like the question you're asking. He was always energetic, worked hard, did a good job, had a positive attitude and all that. And that's all I can say. I wasn't certainly a judge of whether he's a head coach or not. And doesn't surprise me at all that he is. And he'll hopefully be successful at it too.
And what's up with the Cracker Barrel cartel?
Well, he always probably tell you all the crazy stuff I did. He won't tell you all the great accomplishments I had in my career.
That's what friends are for,
space, Coach. You can let it all out.
Yeah. Nobody listens to this show.
Friends like these, Coach.
Y'all may have the same thing, guys, but in coaching, you've always got these people who are wandering up in the office all the time. And some places they do a better job than others of keeping the office closed when you're trying to get things done. But it wasn't very good there because we were in one end of the building, the administration was in the other end of the building, and so we weren't in our own building. And there were people coming in and out of there all the time, and they want to sit around and talk. And I finally just told Coach Croom one day, I said, Coach, is there any way that we can keep the Cracker Barrel cartel members from wandering up in the office when we're trying to work? Everybody looked at me. I think they thought I'd talking about some employees from Cracker Barrel. But that was my nickname. And everybody at Mississippi State's gonna hate me now. And I had a great time there and won some big games. We beat Alabama back to back over there. Who's done that lately?
Nobody, I don't think.
Yeah.
Actually. Well, that's it. It actually sheds some light on what's across the street now, right, from Williams-Brice Stadium. I remember when they were designing that, and Coach Muschamp had so much to do with it. And Shane has said this 1,000 times. He's like, man, you don't understand how awesome this place is. And he admit not that story, not even close, but in how previous stops that he's been to, all these people are just always there. And over here, we're in our own little world, and we get to focus on football and all these things. So, but with Coach, so that he's entering his 4th year, and boy, time has flown. I feel like he just got hired, and I don't know how often y'all communicate. I'm sure I'm sure you talk often enough. Walking into, you remember the first time you were ever a head coach, I'm sure, this first few months, you're drinking from a fire hose. Now imagine that in today's climate with all the crazy stuff you have to deal with off the football field. I think the first time I ever talked to Shane when he got hired, I was like, well, what's it been like? He's like, well, I've come in and, for the first 9 out of 10 things I do, they have nothing to do with the sport of football every day. And I think he's delegated a little bit since and been able to get some people to take on some of that stuff. But do you have, I know you're close. I know he's a friend. So I'm not asking you I'm not trying to paint you in a corner you don't want to be in, but the growth process that he has gone to from year 1 to year 4 and seeing how he's changed and turned into a more established head coach and the things that he's had to do. Can you kind of evaluate that a little bit, or at least give some insight into what he has had to handle and what he's had to do?
Well, not being there, or working for him or around him or anything, I don't have any idea. I would assume, he's getting more and more controlled and comfortable with how to manipulate the whole thing. But add to that, it wasn't COVID, but it was right after COVID. You had some lingering things with that, I'm sure, administratively. The NIL and the portal. And then put on top of that, guys, my saying was always that the SEC was the biggest blessing and the biggest curse that South Carolina athletics ever had. And the old saying, rising tide lifts all boats, but it lifts the ones in the deeper water a little bit higher than it does the other ones over there near the shore. But it's just a tough neighborhood, man. And as far as how he's running the program, I'm not a good judge of that because I've not been there. But when I look at it from the outside in, I don't know what it could have done differently. And I'm not talking about decisions or coaching calls or plays and that kind of thing. Hell, everybody makes mistakes in that. But you got to use the portal. You got to recruit. You got to get some guys in there. I don't think the SEC is a coaches conference. I think it's an athletes conference. I don't think there are people winning football games in the SEC with X's and O's. They may be executing them better than the other guy, but it's just almost hard, if not impossible, to outcoach somebody in the SEC. And I don't know if you can do it in college football at all. It's all about recruiting, discipline, development, and consistency, and all those kind of things. I mean, if you got the right players, you're treating them right, and you're coaching them hard, and you're demanding excellence and detail, then you're going to have the best team. Now you can get a bunch of great players, and you don't have control of them, and there's problems going on that you don't know about, and it won't look like a really good football team. You can't put your finger on it, but I mean that happens. But I think y'all, I mean, you guys have been watching as long as I have. You're not going to outcoach people in that league, and you either recruit with them or you're not going to play with them on Saturday. And that's the bottom line. And you may get you an upset every 2 or 3 years, but you're not going to play consistently at the top of that conference if you can't recruit players that can play at the top of that conference.
There's so much there that you said that I think should be it should be on yeah, exactly. I mean, it's hard to sometimes fans don't want to hear that. They want to believe everything is about the call you made on 3rd and 7, or the blitz package that didn't work, or whether or not you went for it on 4th down and 3. But when you watch SEC week in, week out, and you just look at the games, the more talented team is winning more often than not. I mean, it's a high percentage. Even like a Nick Saban, who the GOAT. So he's winning championships at Alabama. He won championships at LSU. He was a good coach at Michigan State, but he never flirted with any title in East Lansing. It's a different level of athlete that you have there. This might be a difficult question, but I think fans would be curious. You were an analyst for Coach Muschamp for 2 years, correct?
Correct.
So at that point, you already know the ins and outs of the program because you were there under Steve, most of the glory years. And then you watch Will Muschamp, who it's easy to forget, comes out of the gate 17 wins in the first 2 years. I mean, that surpassed a whole lot of expectations locally, regionally, nationally. And obviously it didn't end well, like it usually doesn't for 99% of the head coaches that take a job in big-time college football. How did you take on that role where if you're a control freak, you can't be an analyst because you can only do so much as an analyst? And then B, I'm just curious. I think fans would be curious, and you don't have to answer this if it's too close to home, but what happened to the program where, like I said, it got off to a great start and clearly things just kind of went southward after that?
Well, I think Will did a great job. There was one thing, and I think I shared it with him at one point in time. And this is my personal feeling. I don't think you can recruit at South Carolina the same way you recruit at Texas, Florida, and Alabama, and some of those schools. And our organization was fantastic. Our evaluations were excellent. But I think we were trying to recruit with the big boys in an arena that we were going to have too many misses and get beat too many times on too many kids. And my personal opinion is that you got to zero in on about 6 to 10, maybe 10 if you're lucky, 6 to 10 guys that are going to be NFL players that you got a really good shot. You got it in. The coach played at Carolina. The kid's 40 miles up the road. You got to have something to where you can go in and focus on those guys. And obviously now it's NIL money, and everybody's buying players. We know that. Well, back then it wasn't all that different. It's just somebody had to do it the right way and make sure it gets done. But you can't do that with 40 players at South Carolina. You don't have that kind of magnetism and draw to your program to attract those guys. You got to get guys that may have had an intention of looking at that place for the start. And we talked about the glut of talent that was there when we were there. We were lucky too, okay, a little bit lucky. But I think that's what happened. And as a result, uh, maybe let 3 or 4 get away, but you could have gotten them if you just focused on a few less kids. And then that last 10 guys that come in there with that recruiting class, they need to be Shaq Wilsons, Travian Robinsons. They need to be tough players that are going to develop and you're going to end up being good enough and so forth. Now, today is all different. You got the portal going on and all. I think Shane's got 40 new faces out there the first day of practice. I can't imagine that. I mean, it's just crazy. And I'm not talking about him now. I'm talking about college football. It's a freaking mess. But that's the only thing I felt at that time. As a football coach, his overall knowledge of the game, the organization on the field, the staff, the teaching, and all that, it was as good as I ever saw anytime I've ever been there. And me personally, I didn't enjoy the job because I didn't have any interaction with the players.
Yeah.
And I realized, very soon after I decided to do it, that was something. Now you can do that, but you couldn't back then. And even our young guys who were analysts back then, they were able to sneak around on the practice field and coach too, because nobody knew whether they were a GA or an analyst. And a GA could coach players, but an analyst was not supposed to be coaching players. And so it just reached a point where I was sort of an analyst and no coaching, and so I didn't enjoy it that much. But I just think Will did a heck of a job, and I think they cut the line 1 year too soon. I really think he got it turned. If the COVID year, I mean, I just don't understand how anybody makes a judgment on that COVID year. The whole conference was a mess, and if you right now had to play nobody but conference teams, you'd probably have the same results.
Good Lord, yeah.
I think it's a great point. That's an excellent point. He just said something, Mike, that when you separate the fact from the fiction, I'm not saying this to be rude towards anybody, but the fandom. You talk about Coach Muschamp. I think, because I interacted with him a bunch when he was here, and one of the things that always was so outstanding to me was that we had never met, right, until he first started coming on my shows when I was at ESPN in Charleston, Coach. And he always got the first question, which was, "How are you?" Or he'd remember something that you had told him before, and he'd ask you that question before you ever get a chance to ask him anything about his football team. And that, to me, told me everything I needed to know about him. And then I got to know him, and then figured out that all these people that I know him really well. And off the field, like you can't get any better than Will Muschamp. You just can't. And they kept talking about his organization. And then you just said something a second ago that I've heard, and it's so refreshing to hear it from, in my opinion, one of the best football minds to ever come from this state, if not across the country, and you, Coach Johnson, and how you recruit to South Carolina. And then when they get there, what do you do with them? And I think that's kind of where Coach Beamer is going now with his future classes as well.
Yeah, but it's a whole different world now with that portal. And Will he wanted me to coach outside linebackers. And see, I had helped him a little bit through the interview process. He just, that happens with coaches all the time. He just called in. Lance knew that I knew a lot about the place, and Lance said, "You need to call Eli and just kind of find out what's going on down there." And I talked to him probably 4 different phone calls as he was going through it. And so as soon as he gets the job, he said, "You ready to go?" And I said, "Well, what am I doing?" And he said, "I need you to coach outside linebackers." I said, "Well, I don't think about it," but I said, "Will, I'm probably not going to coach at South Carolina if I can't be the coordinator." I said, I'm not trying to, push anything. I said, "I'm just saying when I was here, it was as good as it's ever been. And I don't want to be I'm not going to come over and coach outside backers under a coordinator that's never been a coordinator before."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Well, I've got to get him for recruiting." And I said, "Well, I understand that." I said, "That's your choice." I said, "I'll try to help you in some other way, but I'm not going to coach as an assistant coach." And I just felt strongly about that because I felt like I would not be a happy camper. And if I was head coach, I wouldn't want somebody in the building like that. And so when he kept trying and trying, he put me on the road for a couple of weeks and all that. And I just, I kept telling him I was more and more sure that I just wasn't going to be able to do that. I wouldn't be happy, and I wouldn't have been. So that, and my point is, he still wanted me to come in as an analyst because he felt like I could help him in some ways, some things to do with Carolina and so forth. And we always had a great relationship.
I'll go out on a limb, and I think I would speak for most fans that said that's you'd like a mulligan on that one. If you got a chance to get Ellis Johnson back as your DC, I think you take that. But I'll let that lie on its own merit.
But I mean, I wasn't going to coach if I wasn't the DC.
Well, yeah, of course.
But what I understood was he was going to be the DC.
Yeah.
He didn't ever kind of say that, but I knew he was. But he was going to hire somebody who'd never been to DC before.
Right.
And that was the only other thing I think. If he had hindsight, I don't know. He might do it different. I'm not talking about hiring me. I think he might have delegated a little bit more in that area. But that wasn't their issues. I think the biggest thing is just that COVID year, and then it got right there when they lost Bentley and kind of the quarterback thing. Never really got that shored up.
We've only got a few minutes left, and let me just say before I ask this question, I can't thank you enough for the time, and we'll have to have you on again.
For a full 3 hours next time.
Yeah.
Pack a lunch.
We can't afford that, but you've been outstanding.
Who's bringing the cooler? I ain't gonna make it 3 hours.
Yeah, I know.
There we go.
Beer's fine. You can drink as much beer as you want.
Let's start catering meals and drinks if we keep you on much longer. I do want to ask you this because you touched on it, and that is I already know you've been very outspoken how you feel about the portal and NIL, and I know deep down that's how most coaches feel, although they don't want to say it publicly because they don't want to be perceived as anti-player or some ridiculous label. So I know where you are on that, but what I'm curious, you've been around the SEC at both Mississippi State and of course at Carolina. We now have no divisions. We now have Texas and Oklahoma. I will bet good money that in the next couple of years, it will be a 9-game conference schedule instead of an 8. With all of that staring you in the face, if you're the head coach at South Carolina, I mean, how do you break through? You guys are the perfect storm of you and Steve and Gilmore and Clowney and Lattimore and Jeffrey. How do you break through this to get to that next tier? Because the tier you're in, it's a big one, and it's not a bad tier to be in. But, boy, when you look up and you see these nationally behemoth programs now in your conference, more NIL money than ever, dominating the portal more than ever, how if you're a South Carolina, and I could ask the same question about 7 other programs in the league, how do you get to the next level?
Right. Well, it's a number of things, and I think may even be harder than when we did it. And if you'll recall now, Georgia wasn't Georgia when we were there, and Florida wasn't really. We were when we first got there, but they weren't by the time we got going. Tennessee wasn't what they'd been historically, and so there were a lot of things, and it always would kind of come down to whether our Western Conference schedule had any bears on it, or could we could knock those guys off. We only had to maybe beat worry about 1 or 2 other guys. Now we had something to do with them not being as good as they'd been, but the fact of the matter is, when we got in our glory days, Georgia and Tennessee and Florida weren't any better than we were. I don't know if that can happen again. One thing for sure, Carolina's not going to be totally in control of it. Those guys are going to have to slip. Like Florida's struggling right now. You don't feel like that's an unwinnable game when you play them right now. They got some recruiting advantages, and so they're going to come back. I hope Billy can get it done. If Billy can't, somebody's going to come in there. It's going to turn sooner or later. But I don't. To answer your question, there's only so much you're going to be able to control. But I don't think, but just a small percentage of it. The answer is not Shane and whoever's below him. The answer is who is above him. And are you really willing to pony up, belly up to the bar with all those guys, or you just want to be in the same room with them? And it's tough now. It's tough.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe when you get down to the recruiting aspect of it, I go back a little bit to what I said. You may not have but so much money in the kitty. And I'd go find me 5 guys every year that everybody wants, and that's who I'd get. And I'd get them somehow, and I'd keep them somehow. And the rest of the players out there, they can't be donkeys, but you can find plenty of players that are looking for a place to play that can play on the same level with those guys. They're just not going to be difference makers. If you could bring in 4 or 5 difference makers every year and not lose them, then you got 20. And if you got 5, you got about 10 on each side of the ball, or 6 on each side of the ball. You can play with those guys. You may not win them all, but you're going to play at the top of that league. But I'm telling you guys, it's an absolutely exciting time, but it's a dark picture now. If you really look at it honestly, it's a tough neighborhood.
You got that right. And you tell it like it is, which is one of the things I've always loved about you. I loved covering you, and I've loved hearing some interviews on other venues that you've been doing over the years. And we will definitely have you back. This was well worth the wait, and could not have been put together a better hour. I know I speak for a lot of Gamecock fans. I can tell you, your time in Columbia will be remembered for a long, long time, and you are always going to be sorely missed.
Yep.
We thank you so much again, and we hope to have you on again soon.
Well, y'all awfully nice for all your comments and everything. I think South Carolina did a lot for me too. Now I will say this: the last podcast I was on with Garcia, and Eric made a mistake of telling us before we started. Now, guys, we can edit this, so don't panic or get upset if you use a cuss word or two. And I just said, "Oh shit, Eric, you didn't have to say that."
That's right.
I don't know. I think we did an hour. It probably wasn't 20 minutes of it left by the time he edited it. This one's been much more civil and more professional.
Well, good news for you too is Pat and Steven have a new show coming out called Tailgate on our network.
I don't know what I was scanning around Instagram and I said, "What is this?" And it's those two sitting at a bar discussing whether they ought to have a podcast. I immediately text. I got both the numbers. I texted them a group text. I said, "Guys, this looks phony. There's not a girl in the whole place."
That's no good.
Oh, not those two.
You can't have that. Ellis, thanks again so much. And again, we'll definitely be back in touch.
Yep.
Okay, man. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Coach.